Sweat pooled in the hollow of Neve's spine, cold and irritating against the heavy silk of a dress that had cost more than her first car. She shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, grimacing as the pinched nerve in her heel flared with a sharp electric heat. The ballroom of the St. Regis was a suffocating ecosystem of wealth and pretense. It smelled of roasted tenderloin floor wax and the aggressive powdery cloud of Chanel No. 5 radiating from the donor committee wives. Neve took a sip of her champagne. It was warm. It tasted faintly of brass and disappointment. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a structural engineer, a woman who spent her days in hard hats looking at load-bearing walls and stress fractures in concrete. But her firm had sponsored a table at this charity gala, something about saving the oceans, though the amount of single-use plastic decorating the ice sculptures suggested otherwise, and her boss had effectively mandated her attendance. "Mingle Neve," he had said, clapping a meaty hand on her shoulder. "Show them we're not just a bunch of math nerds in steel-toed boots." So here she was, wearing a dark plum gown that required a medieval corset of shapewear, holding a lukewarm drink and trying desperately to look like she belonged among people who traded summer homes like baseball cards. She checked her watch. 8:14 p.m. If she stayed for the entree, she could reasonably fake a migraine by 9:30 and be in her sweatpants eating leftover pad thai by 10 o'clock. A sharp burst of laughter cut through the low hum of the string quartet playing in the corner. Neve didn't need to look up to know who it belonged to. Her stomach performed a slow, sickening roll, a visceral reaction that had nothing to do with the crab puff she had eaten 20 minutes ago. It was a laugh she had heard every day for 7 years. A laugh that used to rumble against her cheek when they shared a pillow. A laugh that toward the end had morphed into a weapon of condescension. David. Neve forced herself to breathe in through her nose, counting to 4. "Don't look," she told herself. "Just look at the ice sculpture. Look at the melting swan." But human nature is a pathetic, self-destructive thing. Her eyes drifted across the sea of tuxedos and sequins locking onto the entrance. There he was. He looked infuriatingly good. When they were married, David had possessed a slightly rumpled academic charm. He used to wear corduroy jackets that smelled of old paper and peppermint. Now, 14 months post-divorce, he looked like he had been dipped in liquid capital. The tuxedo he wore was bespoke, hugging his shoulders with a precision that bordered on arrogance. His hair, previously prone to cowlicks, was slicked back with some expensive pomade. He hadn't upgraded his wardrobe on his own. Neve knew that. He didn't have the eye for it. The upgrade was entirely due to the woman clinging to his left arm like a barnacle in a designer dress. Brooke. Neve's grip on her champagne flute tightened until her knuckles went stark, bone white. She had never met Brooke in person. She had only seen her in the curated, hyper-filtered squares of Instagram, back when Neve was still masochistic enough to check David's page. In person, Brooke was somehow worse. She was young, maybe 26, to Neve's 34, and radiated that specific type of unearned confidence that comes from generational wealth and a fast metabolism. She wore a slip dress of emerald green that clung to her hips, her blonde hair falling in effortless beachy waves that took 3 hours in a salon to achieve. Neve felt a sudden, humiliating prickle of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them away furiously. She wasn't sad. She was just angry. Angry that David had taken 7 years of her life, complained about her working late to pay off his student loans, and then the moment he landed a partnership at his consulting firm, decided he wanted a fresher perspective. angry that she was standing here in shoes that made her want to sever her own toes while he looked perfectly effortlessly happy. David handed his coat to the cloakroom attendant, turning his head to say something to Brooke. Brooke threw her head back, laughing, her hand resting flat against the stark white of David's shirt front. It was an intimate, territorial gesture. Neve turned her back to the entrance, stepping closer to a towering pillar of white roses. She needed an exit strategy. The restrooms were across the hall. If she skirted the perimeter of the room, keeping the buffet tables between her and the entrance, she could slip out the side doors, call an Uber, and abandon her boss. She would blame food poisoning. She took a step, her heel catching slightly on the thick carpet. Neve, the voice hit her spine like a bucket of ice water. The world seemed to stutter, the ambient noise of the ballroom fading into a dull, rushing sound in her ears. She stopped. For a fleeting second, she considered pretending she hadn't heard him. She could just keep walking. But that would be cowardice, and Neve, for all her flaws, was not a coward. She took a deep breath, pasted on a smile that felt like it might crack her jaw, and turned around. "David," Neve said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, lacking the indifferent bass she had aimed for. He stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell him. It wasn't the peppermint and old paper anymore. It was something sharp, woody, and aggressively expensive. Sandalwood and bergamot. It smelled foreign. It smelled like a stranger. "I thought that was you," David said. His eyes raked over her, a quick assessing glance that made Neve acutely aware of the slightly dated cut of her dress and the fact that her lipstick had likely faded. There was a smugness in his posture, a relaxed tilt to his shoulders that said, "Look at me. Look at how well I'm doing without you. I didn't expect to see you at something like this. Isn't this a little flashy for your firm?" The condescension was subtle, wrapped in a casual observation, but Neve caught it. It was the same tone he used to use when she talked about her structural designs, reducing her complex engineering work to playing with blocks. "We're expanding our corporate responsibility portfolio," Neve said, hating how defensive she sounded. She forced herself to look at Brooke, who was watching the exchange with large, assessing blue eyes. "Hello." "Oh my gosh, you must be Neve," Brooke gasped, stepping forward. Before Neve could brace herself, Brooke closed the distance and enveloped her in a cloud of gardenia perfume and hairspray. Brooke leaned in, pressing a cool, dry cheek against Neve's right, then her left, making a soft, kissing sound in the air. Neve froze entirely. Her arms remained glued to her sides. The physical contact felt violating, bizarrely intimate for two women who effectively shared the wreckage of a marriage. Brooke pulled back her hands, resting lightly on Neve's forearms. Her skin was flawless, poreless, looking like it had never known a day of fluorescent office lighting. "David has told me so much about you. It is so incredibly nice to finally put a face to the name." "Has he?" Neve replied, stepping back precisely 1 inch to dislodge Brooke's hands. "He hasn't mentioned you at all." It was a petty lie. Of course he hadn't mentioned her to Neve. They only communicated through lawyers and tersely worded emails about the remaining mortgage on their shared condo. But Neve wanted to see the crack in the facade. Brooke's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the corners of her mouth tightening before it bounced back with weaponized sweetness. "Well, you know David. He's so focused on the future these days. He hardly ever looks back." The words were a stiletto to the ribs, smooth, precise, and deeply damaging. Neve felt the heat rising in her neck, an ugly mottled flush that she knew clashed violently with the plum fabric of her dress. David cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs. "Brooke has been helping me revamp the house," he said, the word house dropping heavily between them. The house Niamh had picked out. The house she had laid the tile in for the guest bathroom. "She has a fantastic eye for modernizing spaces, getting rid of the clutter." "Clutter," Niamh repeated flatly. "You know how it was, Niamh. We held on to so much old junk," David said, his tone adopting a patronizing gentleness. "It's refreshing to clear it all out, breathe some new life into the place." Niamh stared at him. She noticed with a petty, vindictive thrill that he had missed a spot shaving right under his jawline. A tiny patch of stubble on an otherwise perfectly manicured canvas. It was the only imperfect thing about him right now, and she focused on it to keep from screaming. She wanted to throw her champagne in his face. She wanted to ask him if the old junk included the photo albums she had carefully curated, or the vintage record player they had found at a flea market on their honeymoon. But doing so would admit that she cared. It would give him the satisfaction of knowing he could still draw blood. Instead, Niamh's brain short-circuited. Under the pressure of David's smug gaze and Brooke's predatory sweetness, her usual sharp wit abandoned her. "Well," Niamh stammered, her tongue feeling too large for her mouth. "That's great. Good for you, both. My boss is—" She gestured vaguely toward the crowd with her glass. A drop of champagne sloshed over the rim, landing directly on her thumb. It felt sticky and cold. She awkwardly wiped it on the side of her dress, immediately realizing she was leaving a damp stain on the silk. David's eyes dropped to the stain, a flicker of pity crossing his face. Pity. That was worse than anger. That was worse than hatred. "You should come over sometime, Niamh," Brooke chimed in, slipping her arm back through David's. She leaned into him, her breast pressing against his bicep. "We'd love to have you for dinner. We're having a new chef install next week, an open concept. You'd appreciate the architecture, wouldn't you?" It was a trap. A blatant, glittering trap designed to parade Niamh through her old life, redecorated by a younger, wealthier woman. "I'm quite busy," Niamh managed, her voice trembling slightly. She hated herself for the tremor. She sounded weak. She sounded like the discarded wife. "Oh, right, the firm," David said, a hint of a sigh in his voice. "Still working 80-hour weeks. Niamh, you really need to find some balance. Life isn't just about staring at blueprints until your eyes bleed. You have to live a little." He was lecturing her. He was standing there with the woman he had left her for in the tuxedo he bought with the money she had helped him save, lecturing her about work-life balance. Niamh's vision tunneled. The ambient noise of the room faded out completely, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the thumping of her pulse behind her ears. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something cutting and final, to tear down his arrogant facade, but nothing came out. The air in her lungs felt thick, like she was trying to breathe underwater. She was losing. She was standing in the middle of a ballroom, surrounded by billionaires and socialites, and she was visibly, pathetically losing to her ex-husband. She took a half-step backward, intending to just turn and run. Dignity be damned. She would just walk away. But before she could retreat, the air pressure behind her shifted. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, deliberate displacement of space. The faint powdery scent of the gala was abruptly overwritten by the smell of rain on hot asphalt and something distinctly masculine, clean linen and vetiver. A large, warm hand settled onto the bare skin of Niamh's lower back. The touch was electric. It wasn't a casual, hovering placement. It was a firm, grounding grip. The heat of the palm seeped instantly through the chill of her sweat, sending a shockwave up her spine. Neve gasped softly, her shoulders tensing, but the hand didn't pull away. It pressed slightly harder, steadying her. "Apologies," a voice rumbled from just over her right shoulder. The voice was deep-textured, like rough-cut velvet, and carrying an innate authority that didn't require volume to command attention. "I got cornered by the mayor. I hope you haven't been waiting long." Neve froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it in boardrooms, usually delivering devastating multi-million-dollar verdicts with quiet detachment. She turned her head slightly. Hayes stood inches from her. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo like the rest of the room. He wore a dark charcoal suit entirely devoid of a tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned to reveal the strong column of his throat. He looked out of place among the glittering elite, not because he lacked wealth, but because he possessed so much of it that he no longer had to play by their sartorial rules. Hayes was the silent backer who had recently acquired a controlling stake in Neve's engineering firm. He was notorious in the financial district, a man who bought failing companies, gutted them, and rebuilt them into empires. He was also notoriously private, rarely attending events like this. Neve had spoken to him exactly 3 times. Once during a site inspection where he had pointed out a microscopic flaw in a load-bearing column that her senior engineers had missed. Once in an elevator where they had stood in complete heavy silence. And once when he had paused by her desk at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, looked at the cold coffee beside her keyboard, and simply said, "Go home, Neve." Now he was standing close enough that she could see the faint silvery scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His dark eyes, usually cold and analytical, were currently fixed on David with the kind of mild curiosity a predator reserves for a particularly slow piece of prey. David's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He recognized Hayes. Everyone in their tax bracket recognized Hayes. Hayes. David said, his voice dropping half an octave as he instinctively tried to match the other man's presence. He extended a hand. "David Miller, we met briefly at the Tech Summit in Geneva last year." Hayes looked at David's outstretched hand. He looked at it for a second too long, just long enough to make it awkward. Then very slowly, Hayes shifted his grip on Neve's back, sliding his hand up slightly to rest on the curve of her waist, and finally reached out to grasp David's hand. "Miller," Hayes said. He didn't say it like a greeting. He said it like a diagnosis. Brooke had gone entirely still. The predatory sweetness was gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, calculating stare. She was looking at Hayes the way a starving person looks at a banquet, evaluating the sheer magnitude of the wealth radiating from him. "We were just catching up," David said, trying to reclaim the upper hand. He laughed, but the sound was hollow nervous. "Neve and I go way back. I was just telling her she works too hard, needs to get out more." Hayes didn't smile. He looked down at Neve. The intensity in his dark eyes was paralyzing. "Is that right?" Hayes asked softly, his thumb brushing a microscopic circle against the silk of her dress at her waistline. The friction sent a flare of heat straight to her chest. Neve started, her voice raspy. She cleared her throat. "David was just leaving." "Actually," Brooke chimed in, her voice an octave higher than it had been a moment ago. "We were just inviting Neve over to see the new house. You should come too, Mr. Hayes. We're installing an open-concept kitchen." The silence that followed was suffocating. Neve felt her stomach drop. Brooke was shameless, pivoting instantly from condescending the ex-wife to networking with the billionaire standing next to her. Hayes slowly turned his gaze from Neve to Brooke. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying emptiness. "I don't eat in open-concept kitchens," Hayes said flatly. "I find them chaotic." Brooke blinked, her mouth snapping shut. David flushed a dull red, creeping up his neck. "Well," David muttered, trying to salvage the interaction. "It's good to see you, Neve. Keep up the hard work." He sounded tight annoyed. The narrative of him being the winner in the divorce was rapidly disintegrating under the weight of Hayes's presence. David tugged slightly on Brooke's arm, signaling it was time to go. He shot one last look at Neve, a look that was meant to be pitying, but came across as deeply insecure. "Let me know if you ever need a recommendation, Neve, for a different firm if the hours are too much." It was a final pathetic attempt to reassert dominance, to remind her that he was the successful consultant and she was the exhausted engineer. Neve felt the anger spike again, hot and bitter on her tongue, but before she could formulate a response, Hayes moved. He didn't speak to David. He didn't acknowledge the insult. Instead, Hayes turned his body fully toward Neve, blocking David and Brooke from her line of sight. "You're tense," Hayes murmured. His voice was low, meant entirely for her vibrating beneath the noise of the ballroom. "I'm fine," Neve whispered, staring at the knotless collar of his shirt. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She didn't know what game he was playing, why he had stepped in, but the sheer proximity of him was overwhelming. She could feel the heat coming off his chest. "You're lying," Hayes stated simply. He lifted his free hand. His knuckles brushed against her cheek, a touch so light it felt like a phantom stroke. Neve flinched slightly, startled by the intimacy, but his hand followed the curve of her jaw, his fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. Neve's breath hitched. She looked up, her eyes wide, meeting his dark, unreadable gaze. "Hold still," he breathed. And then he leaned down. It wasn't a sudden dramatic dip. It wasn't a performance for the crowd. It was a slow, deliberate descent. Hayes tilted his head, his face coming so close that his breath fanned across her lips. Neve froze, her mind completely blank, every ounce of her consciousness hyper-focused on the rough texture of his thumb against her jaw and the scent of rain and vetiver wrapping around her. His lips met hers. It wasn't a polite peck. It was firm, possessive, and shockingly warm. The pressure was commanding his mouth, moving against hers with a quiet, devastating expertise. Neve's eyes fluttered shut involuntarily. For a second, the gala, the pinching shoes, the humiliation, it all vanished. There was only the solid wall of his chest against hers, the firm grip on her waist, and the intoxicating, deeply grounding sensation of being entirely anchored by this man. A tiny, involuntary sound escaped her throat, a soft, surprised sigh. Hayes swallowed the sound, his grip tightening just a fraction, pulling her flush against him. It lasted only a few seconds, but time seemed to warp, stretching the moment out until it felt like an eternity. When Hayes finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He kept his face mere inches from hers, his eyes dark and heavy, tracing the outline of her flushed cheeks. Neve blinked, her lips parted, her chest heaving as she dragged oxygen back into her lungs. She felt dizzy. She felt entirely unspooled. Slowly, Hayes turned his head, glancing over his shoulder. Neve, still held tightly against his side, followed his gaze. David hadn't moved. He was standing exactly where they had left him, but his posture had collapsed. The smugness was entirely eradicated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes darting between Hayes and Neve, as if trying to compute a mathematical equation that defied the laws of physics. In his hand, his cocktail glass had tilted precariously, the amber liquid spilling over the rim and dripping silently onto the toe of his bespoke Italian shoes. Brooke looked like she had been slapped. Hayes looked at David, his expression entirely neutral, completely unfazed by the wreckage he had just caused. "If you'll excuse us, Miller," Hayes said, his voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "Neve and I have plans." Air rushed back into Neve's lungs in a jagged, painful tear. She was moving. Hayes had dropped his hand from her jaw, but the heavy, warm pressure on the small of her back remained acting as a physical rudder. He steered her through the parting sea of tuxedos and gowns. Neve couldn't feel her legs. She was operating entirely on the phantom momentum of his grip, her high heels sinking into the plush carpet, her vision a blurred smear of chandeliers and wide staring eyes. Someone brushed past her, a woman reeking of gin and expensive hairspray, and the contact snapped Neve back to reality. Her lips were tingling. A dull residual heat radiated through her chest, entirely at odds with the cold sweat pooling at the nape of her neck. She had just been kissed, in public, by the man who essentially owned her paycheck. And she had leaned into it. She had made a noise, a pathetic, yielding little sigh that she wanted to reach back into the timeline and violently erase. They breached the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, stepping into the cavernous vaulted lobby of the St. Regis. The temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The air out here was still smelling of lemon polish and wet wool from the cloakroom. The oppressive hum of the gala was abruptly severed as the doors clicked shut behind them. Hayes stopped. He didn't look at her immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit, retrieved a small dark leather wallet, and bypassed the massive line at the coat check. He dropped a folded $50 bill onto the counter. The attendant, a bored-looking college kid, snapped to attention. "Ticket, sir. I don't have one," Hayes said, his voice stripped of the gravelly intimacy it had held moments ago. He was back to being the apex predator of the boardroom. A black wool overcoat, cashmere lining, and the lady's wrap, plum silk. Neve stood frozen on the marble floor. Her brain was furiously trying to sort through the debris of the last 5 minutes. Anger, humiliation, vindication, and an ugly pulsing streak of adrenaline were all fighting for dominance. She looked at Hayes's back, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the tailored wool, the crisp, clean line of his haircut against his neck. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't looking at her for gratitude. He was simply executing an extraction. The attendant scrambled, returning seconds later with the coats. Hayes took them, draped his over his left arm, and turned to Neve. He held up the plum silk wrap. Neve stared at it. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, digging her manicured nails into her own bare skin. "What the hell was that?" Her voice echoed slightly in the marble lobby. It was sharper than she intended, brittle and vibrating with a suppressed panic. Hayes paused, the wrap hovering in the air between them. His dark eyes flicked down to her white-knuckled grip on her own arms, then back up to her face. He stepped closer, entirely ignoring her question, and draped the silk over her shoulders. His knuckles grazed her collarbone. The touch sent a violent, involuntary shiver down her spine. "You're shaking," he observed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of biological fact. "I'm angry," Neve snapped, stepping back so the silk settled heavily against her skin. "I'm very, very angry, and I want to know why you just used me as a prop in whatever dominance game you were playing with my ex-husband." Hayes's expression didn't shift. The faint silvery scar through his eyebrow twitched infinitesimally, the only sign he was processing her outburst. I didn't use you as a prop, Neve. I provided an exit strategy. You looked like you were about to stop breathing. I was breathing perfectly fine. You were hyperventilating, Hayes corrected smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. Your pulse was visible in your throat from 3 yards away. Miller was backing you into a psychological corner, and you lacked the tactical advantage to cut him off. So I intervened. Tactical advantage. He spoke about her deeply personal, humiliating encounter as if it were a hostile corporate takeover, by kissing me. Neve dragged a hand through her hair, ruining the carefully pinned updo she had paid $80 for at a dry bar. Several bobby pins clattered onto the marble floor. You could have just said we had a meeting. You could have said my boss needed me. You didn't have to put your mouth on mine. A meeting wouldn't have derailed his narrative, Hayes said. He looked toward the glass revolving doors at the front of the lobby. A black town car was idling at the curb, rain beginning to streak the tinted windows. He wanted to pity you. He wanted to parade his new acquisition in front of you and leave you standing there feeling obsolete. A handshake and a polite excuse wouldn't have ruined his evening. He turned his gaze back to her, and the raw, unblinking intensity of it made Neve's breath hitch again. I wanted to ruin his evening. Neve swallowed hard. The taste of warm champagne and something distinctly intoxicatingly male coated the back of her throat. She hated that he was right. She hated that David's smug, pitying face had been completely obliterated by the shock of Hayes claiming her. But most of all, she hated that she felt a dark, vindictive thrill about it. Come on, Hayes murmured, gesturing toward the doors. Your feet are bleeding. Neve looked down. The pinched nerve had escalated. The stiff leather of her right heel had rubbed the skin raw, a tiny bead of blood staining the back of her expensive shoe. She hadn't even felt it. I can call a cab, she said, her voice dropping the fight, suddenly draining out of her. She felt impossibly tired. The corset under her dress was cutting into her ribs, and she just wanted to go home, strip the silk off, and scrub her face with hot water. Don't be tedious, Neve, Hayes said softly, stepping past her to push the revolving door. Get in the car. The interior of the town car smelled of expensive conditioned leather and ozone from the rain hitting the windshield. The door slammed shut, slicing off the chaotic noise of the city streets and plunging them into an intimate, heavy silence. Neve sank into the plush leather, resting her head against the cool glass of the window. The streetlights outside smeared into long, golden streaks as the car pulled away from the curb. For 3 blocks, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers and the faint, low hum of the engine. Neve reached down. She didn't care that she was sitting next to a billionaire. She didn't care about decorum. She unbuckled the strap of her right heel, wincing as the leather scraped against the raw blister, and kicked the shoe off. She did the same with the left. She let out a long, ragged exhale, dropping her head back against the headrest. Better, Hayes asked. He was sitting in the opposite corner of the spacious back seat, one leg crossed casually over the other, typing an email on his phone. The bluish light from the screen illuminated the sharp, angular planes of his face. He didn't look up when he spoke. Marginally, Neve muttered. She rubbed her right arch, the muscles cramping under her thumbs. I suppose I should say thank you for back there, even if your methods were completely unhinged. Hayes hit send, locked his phone, and slipped it into his pocket. He turned his head, watching her in the dim light. You don't have to thank me. I did it for my own amusement as much as for your salvation. I didn't need salvation. Your face said otherwise. Neve bristled, dropping her foot to the carpeted floor. You don't know anything about my marriage, Hayes. You don't know what that man took from me. You saw 5 minutes of a dynamic that lasted 7 years. So please don't sit there and analyze me like a spreadsheet. I don't need 7 years of data to recognize a parasite. Hayes replied, his voice deadly calm. He's a man who derives his self-worth from diminishing yours. The woman on his arm is an accessory, not a partner. He was attempting to use her youth to highlight what he perceives as your failure. It was transparent, crude, and deeply boring. Neve stared at him. The blunt clinical accuracy of his assessment felt like a physical blow. It was exactly what she knew deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud by a man who intimidated boardrooms into submission gave it an undeniable, terrifying reality. And the kiss, Neve pushed, unable to let it go. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What was the analytical reasoning behind that? Hayes shifted. The leather seat creaked. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, slightly resting his elbows on his knees. The space between them shrank. Neve could smell the rain on his coat again, mixing with the sharp tang of bergamot. Shock and awe, Hayes said simply. His eyes dropped to her mouth. You needed an anchor. He needed a wrecking ball. It accomplished both. It felt, Neve started, then snapped her mouth shut. She looked away, staring out the window at the blurred neon signs of a pharmacy flashing by. She wasn't going to say it. She wasn't going to admit that it had felt real. That for 10 seconds, the utter humiliation of her divorce had been completely eclipsed by the sheer physical weight of his mouth on hers. It felt real, Hayes finished for her. Neve's head snapped back. Her cheeks burned. I wasn't going to say that. You didn't have to. Hayes leaned back against his seat, watching the streetlights play across her face. It felt real because I didn't fake it, Neve. A man like Miller can smell a performance. If I had kissed you like a brother or like a friend doing a favor, he would have recognized the act. It had to be convincing. So you're just really good at acting. Neve let out a hollow, cynical laugh. Good to know. Remind me never to play poker with you. I never said I was acting. The words dropped into the quiet space of the car like stones into deep water. Neve stopped breathing. The air in the car suddenly felt too thick, too warm. She turned her head, searching his face in the shadows. He was looking right at her. There was no smirk, no playful glimmer in his dark eyes. He looked completely frighteningly serious. What? She managed the word, scraping against her dry throat. I've watched you for 6 months, Neve, Hayes said, quietly. The rhythm of the windshield wipers seemed to amplify, ticking off the seconds. I've watched you tear apart architectural blueprints that older, more arrogant men put together. I've watched you stay in the office until midnight, eating stale pretzels, arguing with contractors on the phone until they yield. He reached across the space between them. Neve stiffened her spine, locking against the leather seat, but she didn't pull away. Hayes's thumb brushed against the corner of her mouth, wiping away a smear of plum-colored lipstick that had bled past her lip line during the kiss. The pad of his thumb was slightly rough. You're brilliant, you're stubborn, and you have a severe inability to ask for help. Hayes continued his thumb, dropping from her lip, to trace the line of her jaw mirroring the touch from the ballroom. Watching that mediocre suit patronize you while you stood there and took it was unacceptable. I am your employee, Neve said. It was a desperate, flimsy shield, but it was all she had left. Her heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. You are an employee of a firm in which I hold a majority stake. Hayes corrected his hand, dropping back to his own lap. That makes me your investor, not your manager. The HR handbook does not apply. The car decelerated, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt as they pulled up to a red light. Neve's mind was spinning. This wasn't happening. Billionaire investors didn't track the dietary habits of their mid-level engineers. They didn't hijack charity galas to exact revenge on their ex-husbands. You're crazy, Neve whispered. I'm efficient, Hayes countered. The car turned onto Neve's street. It was a quiet, tree-lined avenue in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying, entirely disconnected from the glittering skyline they had just left behind. Look, Neve said, leaning forward, needing to put distance between her back and the seat, needing to ground herself. Tonight, what happened back there? It was a one-off, a bizarre, stress-induced hallucination. Tomorrow, I'm going back to my site inspection, and you're going back to buying small countries. The town car glided to a smooth halt in front of her brownstone. The driver killed the engine, leaving the soft hum of the rain. Hayes didn't move to open the door for her. He sat perfectly still in the dim light. Tomorrow is Sunday, Neve, Hayes said. His voice was soft, carrying that velvet texture that made her nerves fray. You don't have a site inspection, but you do have a pinched nerve, a bleeding heel, and a sudden acute awareness that your ex-husband is entirely irrelevant. Neve grabbed her shoes from the floorboard. Her hands were shaking again. She fumbled with the handle of the door, pushing it open. The cold, wet air of the street hit her face, a shocking welcome relief. She swung her legs out her bare feet, hitting the damp pavement. She looked back over her shoulder. Good night, Hayes, she said, her voice tight. Sleep well, Neve, he replied. His dark eyes held hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I'll be in touch. Neve slammed the door shut. She didn't wait to watch the car pull away. She turned and limped up the stone steps to her apartment, the cold rain soaking into her silk dress, her heart pounding a terrifying, undeniable truth against her ribs. He wasn't going to let this go, and God help her, neither was she. Sunday morning tasted like stale copper and cheap ibuprofen. Neve woke up face down on her sofa, her neck violently cramped. She hadn't made it to the bed. The plum silk dress was a crumpled puddle of expensive regret on the hardwood floor near the entryway. She was wearing an oversized college t-shirt and cotton underwear, her right foot heavily wrapped in white athletic tape. She rolled over, groaning, as the stiff muscles in her lower back screamed in protest. The morning light filtering through the blinds was gray and hostile. Outside, the city was quiet, save for the distant rhythmic thud of a garbage truck grinding down a parallel avenue. She dragged herself to the kitchen. The coffee pot was empty. Of course it was. Neve braced her hands on the cold granite countertop, letting her head hang between her shoulders. Her mind, usually a neatly categorized filing cabinet of structural schematics and stress calculations, was a chaotic, humiliating reel of the previous night. David's smug face, Brooke's cloying perfume, the suffocating pity. And then Hayes. Neve squeezed her eyes shut. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on her waist, the precise, shocking heat of his mouth. It hadn't been a gentle, hesitant exploration. It had been an absolute takeover, a physical manifestation of the way he ran his boardrooms. He had looked at the situation, identified the structural weakness in David's ego, and applied targeted, devastating pressure. I've watched you for 6 months. Her eyes snapped open. She turned the faucet on, fiercely splashing freezing water onto her face. It didn't help. The chill only seemed to highlight the lingering heat in her cheeks. He was her investor. He was a billionaire who operated on an entirely different plane of reality. People like Hayes didn't actually notice people like her, not outside of quarterly earnings reports. At 10:14 a.m., the buzzer to her apartment barked. Neve jumped, splashing water down the front of her shirt. She stared at the intercom on the wall. She wasn't expecting anyone. Deliveries usually just left packages in the vestibule. She pressed the talk button, her voice raspy. "Yes, courier," a bored voice crackled back. "Got a tube here, requires a signature." Neve frowned. She buzzed him in, pulling a thick fleece robe over her t-shirt and limping to the door. She cracked it open just as a young man in a heavy rain slicker reached the landing. He handed her an electronic pad and a heavy matte black cardboard architectural tube. She scribbled her name, her brow furrowing. Her firm never sent schematics to her home on a Sunday. Closing the door, she carried the tube to her dining table, which doubled as her drafting desk. The black cardboard was unmarked, save for a small white adhesive label, with her name printed in stark minimalist font. She popped the plastic cap off. Inside was a tight roll of heavy bond blueprint paper. And something else. A small, heavy glass jar dropped into her palm as she slid the papers out. It was dark amber glass with a plain black lid. No label. She unscrewed it. The scent of raw shea butter eucalyptus and something faintly medicinal drifted up. It was a salve. She set it down slowly, her heart picking up a heavy rhythmic thud. She unrolled the blueprints, pinning the corners down with her coffee mugs. They were the preliminary foundation schematics for the Hudson Yards expansion project, a multi-billion-dollar development that her firm had bid on, but lost to a massive international conglomerate 3 months ago. Attached to the top left corner was a heavy stock index card. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and aggressively sloped. The conglomerate's engineers are relying on a standard grid load distribution. Look at the subsoil reports on page 4. They're going to sink an inch a year on the east elevation. I bought the primary contractor this morning. Redraft the support pillars using your cantilever model from the 4th Street project. Have it on my desk tomorrow at 8 a.m. Put the salve on your feet. H. Neve stared at the card. She read it 3 times. He hadn't sent flowers. He hadn't sent a cliched apology note or a diamond bracelet to smooth over the fact that he had hijacked her autonomy the night before. He had sent her a structural nightmare, a multi-million-dollar puzzle, and explicitly demanded her brain. He was telling her in the exact language she spoke that he respected her competence above everything else. The salve was just a quiet, arrogant footnote that he remembered she was bleeding. A slow, involuntary smile cracked the tight, stressed lines of Neve's face. It was the first time she had smiled genuinely in 14 months. She looked at the clock. 10:30 a.m. She pulled her mechanical pencil from the cup on the table, opened the jar of salve, rubbed a thick layer onto her raw heels, and sat down. Monday was loud. The construction site for the new financial district tower was a cacophony of shrieking metal, the heavy rhythmic thudding of pile drivers, and the sharp ozone smell of arc welders. Dust hung in the air, a fine gritty mist that coated everything in a dull gray film. Neve was in her element. She stood on the exposed concrete of the 14th floor, the wind whipping her hair around the hard plastic shell of her helmet. She wore heavy steel-toed boots, thick denim, and a high-visibility vest over a flannel shirt. A massive roll of revised schematics, the ones she had stayed up until 4 a.m. perfecting for Hayes, was tucked under her arm. She was currently pointing a laser measure at a steel I-beam, arguing loudly with Greg, the site foreman. "I don't care if the supplier said it's within tolerance," Greg Neve shouted over the noise of a nearby generator. "It's a 1/4 inch off plumb. When you stack 30 more floors on top of this, that 1/4 inch becomes a critical shear vector. Tear it down and realign the brackets." Greg, a man built like a fire hydrant with a permanent scowl, rubbed a massive calloused hand over his face. "It's gonna cost us 2 days, Neve. Better 2 days now than a congressional hearing when the glass shatters on the south facade in 3 years. Neve snapped back, entirely unyielding. Greg grunted, yielding to her logic. He keyed his radio to bark orders at the steelworkers. Neve lowered the laser measure, rolling her shoulders to work out a knot of tension. She turned toward the temporary construction elevator, intending to head down to the site office. She stopped dead. Stepping off the rusted, rattling metal grate of the hoist was David. He looked violently out of place. He was wearing a light gray custom suit, expensive Italian loafers, and an expression of deep, uncomfortable revulsion as he looked around the dirty, loud, dangerous environment. He spotted Neve and immediately began navigating across the uneven concrete slab, dodging stray rebar and coiled electrical wires with awkward, jerky steps. Neve didn't move. She just watched him approach, a cold, calculating numbness spreading through her chest. "Nev," David said, his voice straining to be heard over the industrial noise. He stopped 5 feet away, coughing slightly as a gust of wind blew concrete dust into his face. He brushed frantically at the lapel of his suit. "I need to talk to you." "You're not wearing a hard hat, David," Neve said flatly. "You're violating OSHA regulations just by standing there. Get off my floor." David flushed, anger flashing in his eyes. He hated when she pulled rank in her professional environment. It challenged his authority. "Don't do that. Don't play the tough foreman with me right now. This is serious." Neve crossed her arms, the roll of blueprints heavy against her ribs. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You have exactly 2 minutes before I call security and have you physically escorted out of this zone." David stepped closer, his face twisting into a mask of aggressive, patronizing concern. "Brooke is upset. The gala on Saturday. Hayes embarrassed us. He embarrassed me. And you just let him. You let him use you to make a point." "Brooke is upset," Neve repeated, testing the words on her tongue. They tasted utterly pathetic. "You came to an active, dangerous construction site because your 26-year-old girlfriend got her feelings hurt by a billionaire. I came here because you are making a massive mistake," David hissed, abandoning the concern for raw, ugly insecurity. "Do you honestly think a guy like William Hayes is interested in you? He's a corporate shark, Neve. He guts companies for sport. He saw me, a guy who used to work parallel to his firm, and he used you to take a swing at me. You're a pawn. When he's bored, he's going to drop you, and you're going to look like an absolute fool." Neve looked at him, really looked at him. For 7 years, this man's approval had been her compass. When she worked late, she felt guilty for neglecting him. When she got a promotion, she downplayed it so he wouldn't feel financially emasculated. She had shrunk herself to fit into the negative space of his ego. Standing here now, looking at his tailored suit, covered in her construction dust, listening to him frantically try to regain control over a narrative that no longer included him, she realized something profound. She didn't hate him anymore. He wasn't worth the energetic output of hatred. He was just structural fatigue. A weak, load-bearing column she had finally replaced. "Are you finished?" Neve asked quietly. David blinked, thrown by her lack of emotion. "Nev, I'm trying to protect you." "No, you're not," she replied, her voice steady, carrying the absolute, unshakable authority she used to dictate the safety of skyscrapers. You're trying to protect yourself. You left me David. You blew up our life because you wanted something shiny and new, and you needed me to be the broken, exhausted wife left behind to validate that choice. My misery was the foundation of your new happiness. David opened his mouth to argue, but Neve stepped forward, closing the distance. She didn't flinch. And then Saturday happened. She continued, her eyes locked onto his, stripping away his defenses layer by layer. And you realized I'm not broken. You realized that a man with 10 times your intellect and 100 times your power looked at me and saw value. It terrified you. Because if I have value, then you made a mistake. And you, David, cannot handle being wrong. That's insane, he stammered, taking a half step backward, instinctively, retreating from the sheer force of her presence. You're delusional. I'm an engineer, Neve said coldly. I deal in stress testing. You failed the test. I survived it. She pointed a gloved finger toward the rusted metal gate of the hoist. Take the elevator down, David. Go back to your open concept kitchen. Do not ever contact me again. David stood frozen, his mouth working silently. He looked around, suddenly acutely aware of the hard-eyed steelworkers pausing to watch the exchange. The environment was aggressively hostile to him, and the woman standing in front of him was an absolute stranger. He spun around, nearly tripping over a heavy electrical cable, and marched back toward the hoist, his posture rigid with humiliation. Neve watched the metal gate slide shut, watching his gray suit disappear as the cage descended. She let out a long, slow breath. The knot in her lower back, the one that had been there for 14 months, simply dissolved. You handled the shear vector well, a voice rumbled over the noise of a generator. Neve jumped, spinning around. Hayes was standing 20 feet away, leaning casually against a pallet of cinder blocks. He was wearing dark jeans, heavy leather boots, and a black canvas jacket. A white hard hat sat securely on his head. He looked completely comfortable in the dust, and the noise lacking any of the nervous, frantic energy David had radiated. Neve's heart kicked into a higher gear, a sudden rush of adrenaline flushing through her. How long have you been standing there? Long enough, Hayes said, pushing off the cinder blocks and walking toward her with that slow, deliberate, space-consuming stride. He didn't wear a hard hat. I considered pushing him off the edge for the OSHA violation alone. You didn't step in, Neve noted, her grip tightening slightly on her blueprints. You didn't need me to... Hayes stopped in front of her. The wind caught a piece of her hair that had escaped her helmet, whipping it across her cheek. He reached out his gloved thumb, gently pinning the strand behind her ear. The contrast of the rough leather against her skin was electric. You dismantled him perfectly. Neve looked up into his dark, assessing eyes. The sheer intensity of his focus was intoxicating. You sent me the Hudson Yards schematics. I did. I stayed up until 4 a.m. fixing the primary contractor's pathetic load distribution math. I know, Hayes murmured, a faint, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. You're a workaholic, Neve. It's one of your better qualities. It's a multi-billion-dollar project, Hayes. You don't hand that over to a mid-level engineer because you're trying to prove a point. I handed it to you because you're the only person I trust to keep the building standing. Hayes corrected his voice, dropping in pitch, becoming an intimate rumble that vibrated against the industrial noise around them. And because I knew the only way to get your attention away from your ex-husband's ghost was to give you a puzzle you couldn't refuse. Neve let out a short, breathless laugh. You are incredibly manipulative. I am highly motivated, Hayes countered. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. The smell of vetiver cut sharply through the scent of ozone and dust. The blueprints are an excuse, Neve. The project is an excuse. I don't hide my intentions, and I don't play games I don't intend to win. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The promise of it hung heavily in the narrow space between them, thick and inevitable. So, Neve whispered, looking up at the towering steel skeleton of the building rising above them, and then back at the man who had effortlessly shifted the gravity of her entire world. What's next? Next, Hayes said, his eyes darkening as he looked down at her. You hand me those blueprints, and then I take you to dinner, somewhere entirely devoid of open concept kitchens. Neve smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She unrolled the heavy paper, tapping the revised calculations with her gloved finger. You're paying, she said, and the concrete pours at dawn. Did Neve's cold, calculated takedown of her ex give you the vindication you were craving? If you loved this grounded, gritty look at rebuilding life after betrayal, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more raw audio dramas. Drop a comment below. How would you have handled David at the gala share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth? See you next time.